Sorry for looking down a lot in this video. Obviously, there's a lot of glare in my glasses and I can't see without them. So I'm not really going to be making a lot of eye contact with the camera. I hope you'll understand. So, ever since the first video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey, was released in 1972, the video game industry has been shoved forward by an absolutely voracious appetite for innovation. In the dumpster fire that is online opinions, you'll find many people arguing about these consoles, talking about which ones they think are the best or the worst, whether it be of all time, of their generation, of their brand, and many other criteria. You might be thinking, oh boy, I really need another opinion on these topics. Well, fear not, because I am here to add to the arguments with my own. But I do consider it a bit of a unique argument. Something that I don't necessarily see being discussed all that often is the question of which video game system is the most important to the current market space. As in, which console really shaped the space of gaming into what we know it as today? And to that question, I would submit the answer is Sony's PlayStation 3. You might be wondering what the hell I'm on about, because for most people who are just casual gamers, the PlayStation 3 wouldn't really present itself as a very important or necessarily special video gaming system. So, we're going to get started by running over a little bit of the history of the PlayStation 3 and exactly why I believe the PlayStation 3 was impactful. So, the PlayStation 3 was released in 2006 following the massive success of the PlayStation 2, which was released in the year 2000. With this massive success that was the PlayStation 2 that absolutely dominated the console market, you would think that Sony, with their next console, would be incredibly conscious and very worried about living up to the legacy of the PlayStation 2. However, Sony instead got a big head, thinking that nobody else on the console market space could really compete with them, um, as with the PlayStation 2 generation, nobody really was competing with Sony. They led by a long margin. So, thinking that nobody could really compete with them, it led to Sony making a lot of choices with the PlayStation 3 that were very interesting, to say the least. Now, keep in mind, I didn't exactly say that the PlayStation 3 was the best console of all time, just that I believe that it was the most revolutionary and that its impact on gaming as a whole has a massive effect on the console market today. So, to begin with discussing these interesting choices, we'll talk about the actual physical design of the console in the first place. The PlayStation 3 in its original model was absolutely fucking massive. And I mean, it was just a huge chunk of a console. And the shell of the original model, PS3, was almost entirely a glossy black finish. And on the more expensive model that came with a 60 gigabyte hard drive, they had chrome trim around the front of the console. So, this was all to obviously create a very futuristic look. It also had a very smooth design language. It was very curved as opposed to the matte finish and blocky look of consoles in the past. So they were definitely trying to do something futuristic. In fact, it's noted by a lot of people that PlayStation 3 really looks like it's floating. If you have a clean model, you don't really see any that are in good condition nowadays of those original PS3s, but a really clean model, if you look at it from certain angles, it sometimes looks like it's floating. So they really tried to do a very futuristic design with the original PlayStation 3. They were really trying to push a very futuristic aesthetic. So aside from just looks, Sony obviously has to make a console that's capable of a lot more than the previous generation of consoles, or else you know, they wouldn't sell anything. So aside from looks, let's talk about what Sony actually did with the console to make it special. Sony put a tremendous amount of effort into making the PlayStation 3 a product that really felt brand new and innovative even for the time that it was released in 2006. In the early days of the PlayStation 3, the entire focus was on pushing the idea of the console being some space age, powerful system that they were giving you, the consumer, access to on the open market. And really, that's not entirely untrue. See, due to its custom processor designed in partnership with Toshiba and IBM, the PlayStation 3 was incredibly powerful. It was an incredibly powerful computer, let alone console. It was actually so powerful for the time that the Air Force Research Lab used a cluster of 1,760 of them in tandem to create what was at the time the Department of Defense's fastest computer and the 33rd fastest supercomputer in the world. Now, that's really just an interesting little tidbit of information that doesn't have necessarily too big of an impact on actual home entertainment and gaming. But that is just a little bit of evidence to show you exactly what kind of innovation they were pushing in the power department. The console was incredibly powerful for its time. Now, aside from what the console could do as a supercomputer, it was pretty damn powerful on its own accord as an entertainment system. The PlayStation 3 was the first console to have an HDMI output in true native 1080p resolutions. Its close competitor, the Xbox 360, didn't actually have an HDMI port upon launch. They ended up adding an HDMI port to later iterations of the console after they had, seen the PlayStation 3 and what it was capable of. And it also never truly got full 1080p support. It did have the ability to upscale resolutions to 1080p, but it was never native 1080p capable. So, aside from resolutions, Sony's PS3 boasts the fact that it was incredibly early to the party in making Blu ray discs its primary form of media playback, which wasn't featured in really any other console until when in 2003 the next generation of consoles was released with the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. The PlayStation 3 used Blu ray discs to play back its games, and it could also play Blu ray discs as Blu ray movies, and that was incredibly innovative for the time because at the time in 2006, if you were around, then I'm sure you remember buying just a Blu-ray disc player was incredibly expensive. And with the PlayStation 3, you got that in your console. So Sony also put incredible emphasis on making the PlayStation 3 a really all-in-one console. They really wanted it to have a multimedia effect to it. It was internet connected, which it was actually the first console to be released with full internet compatibility right off the bat. See, the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox, the original Xbox, were capable of connecting to the internet, but you had to buy a network expansion adapter to make that happen. Same with the first model of the Xbox 360. The Xbox 360 also needed an adapter to connect to the internet. They did change that, however, like adding the HDMI port. After they saw that the PlayStation 3 had built-in internet capabilities, they started making their consoles with built-in internet capabilities. However, the PlayStation 3 was the first console to have built-in internet compatibility. The PlayStation 3 also had a digital storefront, which was obviously an entirely new thing. Obviously, 2006, disc-based media was still the primary form of media that people were using to play video games, but the PlayStation 3 did introduce the idea of a digital storefront. It could play back Blu ray media discs like movies, which we did mention earlier, and it could also access streaming apps and much more. Sony truly tried their absolute hardest to make the PlayStation 3 the go to device for any media in a household. Not just games. That's really what they were trying to push and sell with the PlayStation 3 was a box that you could use for any of your needs. In fact, the slogan for the PlayStation 3 was, "It can only do everything." So, how does this impact newer consoles? Well, if the PlayStation 3 and its capabilities sound rather familiar to you, I wouldn't be surprised. Because many consoles nowadays follow a similar formula to the PlayStation 3, with many consoles continuing to follow a pattern of having futuristic and premium looking designs. Just the design of consoles in general has shifted post PlayStation 3. Obviously, we're in the era of high definition, and so all consoles are shipped with HDMI ports. Consoles have especially put a lot of emphasis on being that everything box that can do anything in your house, play movies, streaming apps, streaming services, play games, you name it. Obviously, play games is a gaming console. But console brands have continued to pull from the successful aspects of the PlayStation 3 for years by doing their best to market their console as one that is capable of doing anything. So I think it's only fair at this point in the video we start talking some counter arguments as to why I might be crazy for saying the PlayStation 3 is the most innovative and important console of all time. So, although I've covered a lot about what makes the PlayStation 3 wonderful, like how its power push graphic in gaming, its multiple capabilities set the standard for how consoles are developed, and how its physical design has influenced the design language for much of the console space after its release, um, I feel it's important to talk about the many cases that can be made against the PlayStation 3 and be made for other consoles. Well, first things first, let's get straight to the elephant in the room. The PlayStation 3 is widely considered Sony's biggest failure as far as consoles go, and it is for good reason. The PlayStation 3 wasn't terribly popular in the years following its release. In part, I would say it's due to the absolutely horrendous ad campaign in its early years. I will show a clip of that. But mostly it failed due to its incredibly high price for a consumer electronic, especially in 2006. The PlayStation 3 at its release cost $600 in 2006, which is upwards of $800 in today's money, inflation adjusted. So naturally, people will wonder why I would consider the PS3 the most influential and important console in gaming history. Especially since it was such a dud in the market, it seems kind of counterintuitive to think of a console that really did flop as so important with gaming history. And obviously, there are more obvious contenders for the spot of most influential console in gaming history, uh, such as the Magnavox Odyssey or the original Atari 2600 series, I believe. Those were, in fact, first generation consoles, and those were the consoles that brought video games to the home market. So obviously, there's a case to be made why those would be the most influential consoles in gaming history. They were the ones that brought consoles to home markets. It's a very simple but effective argument. Another strong contender would be the PlayStation 1, of which I am wearing a shirt of because I am a big fan. The PlayStation 1 has a very good case to be made as the most influential console in gaming history because it was the first home console to have 3D rendered graphics. That is, actual 3D models on screen that are rendered for the games. And it was the first console to have that capability of doing 3D rendered graphics. It was also the first console to introduce games on CD discs, which had a much higher storage capacity than the cartridges most consoles used at the time. So there's a very good case to be made as to why it's the most influential console of all time, especially because all of our consoles use discs now and have 3D graphics. It's PlayStation 1 is the one that started it all. So it is a very good argument to be made. Another one that would likely be a lot of people's pick for, again, very obvious reasons would be the PlayStation 2, especially because it's the highest selling game console of all time. That makes it a very easy pick to make. Obviously, the one that sold the most is the most revolutionary. It reached the most amount of people, and also it was the first console to introduce DVD playback. So you could play DVD movies on it, which did introduce a little bit of the aspect of being an all in one home media box. Or even a case can be made for the PlayStation 4, which came back after the PlayStation 3's failures and once again solidified Sony and PlayStation as the king of consoles. after the PS3 failed. So these are all very good choices to make. However, I would argue that even Sony's shortcomings with the PlayStation 3 are exactly what pioneered the gaming economy into what it is today. For example, PlayStation 3 had that complex system architecture which we talked about. It's what made it so powerful. It was designed custom by Sony, Toshiba, and IBM. But that complex system architecture also made it incredibly difficult for developers to develop games on the platform. This led to a lot of games running poorly and performing terrible on the console despite its incredible power. But it also led to an important reform in the design of console architecture. See, Sony learned from the mistakes made with the PS3's architecture, and with both of their following consoles, they put heavy emphasis on designing the consoles in such a way that developers could use them to their full potential. Obviously, since the PS3 was so focused on power, Sony didn't want to go backwards in that aspect, so they still try to make their consoles very, very powerful and use sometimes custom architectures to do so. However, they still talk with development teams and make sure that what they're doing is still easy to develop on. And that's an important step forward in console design architecture, which was directly brought on by the fact that the PlayStation 3 performed poorly. There was a mistake made with the PlayStation 3, and Sony went out to fix it, and that led to innovation. Another innovation in game design in particular, which was caused by Sony's mistakes with the PlayStation 3, is actually just the way in which Sony handles designing games nowadays in the first place. So Sony has always been very adamant about having exclusive titles. They've had exclusive titles since the PlayStation 1 days. However, with the PlayStation 3, where developers were struggling so bad to make video games run properly on their platform, a lot of the games that were shipped on both Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 ran a lot better on Xbox 360, and that was obviously a bad look for Sony. So, what Sony did was they put a lot more emphasis on having their studios that they own publish first party IPs that were exclusive to the PlayStation 3 so that these studios had the resources and time to learn the PlayStation 3's architecture and use it to its full potential. So, even though that was particularly brought about by the PlayStation 3's hardware being hard to develop for, PlayStation still uses this design ideology with creating their games nowadays. They have a lot of studios that they buy out to use to make games exclusive to their platform so that they can use their platform to the highest ability possible. Yet another mistake made with the PS3 that led to a change in the game industry as a whole is its initial market flop and pricing. And this is actually good for modern day consumers. Now, I would have been really upset to pay $600 for a console back in 2006, but after seeing what happened with the PlayStation 3's launch flop, Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft have all made tremendous efforts to sell higher quality products at more competitive price points. This means that in not wanting to recreate the PS3's market failure, console brands have started putting emphasis on delivering consumers higher quality products at comparatively cheaper prices. For all these reasons, the good and the bad, even though you can make many cases for other consoles, such as the PlayStation 1's bringing 3D graphics to the scene, the original consoles obviously starting it all, and other consoles just performing better in the market in the first place, I still feel that the PlayStation 3, with its successes and shortcomings, are exactly what drove the gaming industry to be where it's at today. See, obviously, the PlayStation 3 brought us into the era of HD gaming. It forced Xbox to better their products by adding HDMI port support and internet connectivity without having to add adapters to the console. And just overall, everything that they did well, you still see in the design of consoles nowadays, and everything that they did wrong, companies have specifically taken note to avoid, which has also pushed innovation forward. Now, I did forget to mention throughout the video a couple of my sources, so I'll read them off now. So our information about the PlayStation 3s being used to create a supercomputer for the Air Force comes from military.com in an article titled "The Air Force Built One of the World's Fastest Computers Out of PlayStations," which was published February 17th, 2023. So a lot of the information that I get about the PlayStation 3 as a console and its architecture and design history is from Rodrigo Copetti's article, PlayStation 3 Architecture, a Supercomputer from Another Planet, on the Copetti site, copetti.org, published the 20th of October 2021. It's one of the most in-depth articles about the PlayStation 3 that I've ever read. Although this isn't an actual academic source, I'd also like to credit a lot of the information about my talking points to my favorite YouTuber, Mystic Ryan. His name's Ryan Benecki. Even though I can't necessarily use him as a academic source, he's been covering PlayStation news for years and is one of the more trusted informants about PlayStation news, and also is just about the internet authority on PlayStation 3s. Dude is great. I love him. I took a lot of inspiration from him. I don't do this whole video thing as well as he does, but I would like to credit Mystic Ryan. So another one of my sources that I used for the actual talking about the history of the PlayStation 3 was also gained from an article titled "A Brief History of the PlayStation 3," published June 22nd, 2023, on the Tech Advocate website, www.thetechadvocate.org. I will put some um, a graphic of like the actual sources typed out, like a kind of like a works cited at the end of the video so that you can access those sources. Dear my English teacher. And aside from that, um, we are done here. Thank you.